for preparing and coming every Sunday morning, snow or sleet or ice.
That's right. So it's easy to say, Jay, from the comfort of our homes. All right. We are on Tes Zion on the base. So last week we finished the whole sugya of Rav and his views, and we ultimately said that he was reliant on Rav Meir of Adam Makna Davish Labola Olam, which, by the way, is the subject of much discussion in many other Gemaras, not just ours. So we completed that sugya, and we're at the two dots, which is about 20 lines maybe from the top. Okay, so now we turn from Rav to Shmuel, and we say as follows: Omer Shmuel, Hamotzi Shtar Hakno. If someone finds a Shtar Hakno in the street, what is a Shtar Hakno? We discussed this weeks ago. A Shtar Hakno is a different kind of document. Normally, when a person borrows money, you write a Shtar Chov, you write a document of obligation. And what that says basically is Ruvain lends Shimon $1,000 on Rosh Chodesh Adar, and it's signed by the witnesses. It may have a payback date or not a payback date, and it's signed by witnesses. That's a regular Shtar Chov. A Shtar Hakna is a document where it says that Ruvain lends Shimon $1,000, and the payback is automatic. In other words, we are no longer concerned about the actual events as to whether Reuven lent Shimon the $1,000, because obviously in a Shtar Chov, that would be the condition upon which Shimon would have to pay back if he borrowed the money. So you remember that we got into all kinds of issues. How do we know, in fact, that the loan went through, right? It could be that they wrote a shtar for Rosh Chodesh Adar, and came to Rosh Chodesh Adar, Shimon says, hold off, I don't need the money just yet. So the shtar says in Rosh Chodesh Adar, but he didn't lend him the money. And he lent him the money at some point later, or did he actually lend him the money? Those are all the questions that arise about a shtar chov when the question comes, how do we deal with a lost shtar? Was the money borrowed? To whom should the shtar go? And we'll discuss that a little bit later. What we're talking about is the shtar akna, where there was a guarantee. The loan guaranteed the repayment regardless of when or if he made the loan. So that shtar hakna has a whole different component to it. And we're no longer worried, did he lend it? Did he lend it on the right date? Is it predated? Maybe he didn't borrow the money yet. Maybe he was gonna borrow the money. We're not concerned. With the shtar hakna, it's an ironclad guarantee of payment. So it's a different kind of shtar. So now you can understand if someone finds a shtar hakna in the street, what to do with it. So says the Gemara very simply.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt so early, but throughout this Gemara so far, we've always been assuming that that the buyer and seller, or the lender and the debtor, they follow common business practices. What business practice would this type of document? I was reading ahead a little bit and I couldn't understand. Where would a document come by where the debtor says, I agree to repay you whether or not you lend me the money, right? Isn't that a shtar hakna?
That's a shtar hakna.
Right.
And so you're right. It's a very good question. In the ordinary course, why would someone sign such a document?
Right.
Given the fact that he may not have borrowed the money in the first place. So there's a couple of ways to look at a shtar hakna. But behind the shtar hakna might be a previous dealings between the parties. In other words, if Reuben and Shimon had previously had dealings, and maybe Shimon was indebted to him regarding another matter, or maybe he did him a tremendous favor for which he never repaid him. In other words, what's on the surface is a loan, right? That's what's on the surface because he's about to borrow the money from him. But Shimon determines, you know what? Regardless of whether or not I'm going to make this loan, I really feel indebted to this fellow, and I'm going to say ironclad, I'm going to pay him this $1,000. Yeah, if I make the loan, it'll be for the loan. But if I don't make it for the loan, then I'm still indebted to him, or he's paying him for future services. In other words, goodwill. He's giving him the money because he wants something from him. And when he gets that something down the road, then fine. This will be sort of the payback, if you will. Now, the caveat, of course, is that within the Shtar HaKnah, there are payback provisions. So it's not as if he's really giving him a gift, because at some point in time, if this loan should go through, he will require repayment. But if it doesn't go through, then there will be no repayment. In other words, okay, so in the four corners of the document, your question is a good one. Why would he do it? But we have to look outside the four corners, and we have to see what's really going on between Reuven and Shimon. Why is he making this loan? Why is he being guaranteeing the loan?
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Rashi says, Shtar HaKnah, shekonu mimenu, that he's kaineh, she'afilu lo yilveh ha'ma'os sheyaved atzmo l'shalmon. Even if he doesn't borrow the money, he is obligated. So the obligation supersedes the actual loan, which gives rise to the point that it's maybe not really because of the loan. The loan is kind of the excuse, but there's other reasons as well. All right. So now, as you would imagine, with such a document, he returns it to the creditor. The balim here is the creditor. He returns it to the creditor and not the debtor. Why? So the Gemara says the imishum because of lilvos lo love. If you're going to say, oh, wait a minute, why does he do that? But if it's a shtar halva, he didn't borrow. Or shibit nafshe, he obligated himself. So you can't. It's no longer dependent on the loan, right? V'im mishum paron, and if you're worried about payback, lo chashina leparon. We're not worried about payback then. Isa, the para mikra have a correlate, because he holds of the theory that you would tear it up, what we call canceling the document. In other words, either we're not worried about the loan and we're not worried about payback because the minute was to tear up the document, so the document shouldn't exist anymore, or mark it with a big red marker, paid or something. So in other words, there would be no reason not to give it to the creditor. That's Shmuel's position. Ashtar hakno, you give it to the creditor. Okay, so now let's take a look. Okay, Omer Rav Nachman. So that's Shmuel's doctrine. Ashtar hakno, no question, it goes to the creditor. Omer Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman says, yes. I remember Abba min Safre Daine Demar Shmuel. My father was one of the Sofrim in the court of Shmuel. In other words, he would write he would be a Sofer who would write the declarations. The many things that come up in court have to be written down. It's not like a court reporter. It's more like the scribe who has to write the document. So he was a Sofer who wrote the documents. Bahavina, and Kvar Shisa, Kvar Sheva, and I remember being 6 or 7 years old, being very descriptive. The kind of Dahavim Machras that they used to call out from a Hanishtar Aknosa, Mishtache Beshuka, Nehadrina Lamare. And I remember they would call out in a case involving a Shtar Hakno, that it was found that it should be returned to the Balim, to the Lamare, to the owner, to the creditor. So he says, I remember as a little boy, that's what they used to pronounce in Shmuel's court. So that it's kind of a support, yes, that Shmuel, yes, years ago, I remember that was what they did in Shmuel. So kind of a way of saying it's a riot of Shmuel. Okay, but it's kind of an anecdotal thing that he said. Now, Amar Rav Amram. Rav Amram says, Afanan Tanina. Not only is it anecdotal, but we actually have a Mishnah that supports Shmuel. What's the Mishnah? Kol Masa Bezdin Harizeh Yachzin. Every deed of court, any act of court, you should return. Alma lo chashinon li paroi. If every act of court you return to the Balim, then we are not afraid, we're not afraid of paroi. By the way, this Mishnah is our Mishnah later in the Gemara. Take a quick look on Chav Chofam at Aleph. It's the last Mishnah of Shnai Mochsin. And there, the Mishnah says there, Motza Igros Shum, the Igros Mazon, Shtari Chalitzo Me'inan, Shtari Birurin. These are all documents that make their way through the court system, right? Chalitza, special letters of mazon, of sustenance. These are all documents. B'chol Ma'aseh Bezdin, says the Mishnah, and every act of a Bezdin, whatever goes through a Bezdin that the Bezdin has to sign off on, Harizeh Yachzir, that goes back to the Bala. So you see, this is that Mishnah that he's referring to, and we'll get to that Mishnah later, Mitzvah Shem. But the point is that you see it's a Beferish Mishnah that all acts of court are returned to the Balim. Now, this Shtar Hakno is an act of court. What is the Shtar Hakno? You come before the Bezdin, and the creditor and the debtor, the Lova and the Malva are there, and everybody signs, and therefore you see that it's a valid document. So that's an act of court. So says Rav Nachman, that's a Beferish Mishnah. Amram rather. Rav Amram says, Kol Ma'aseh Bezdin Harizeh Amar lo chashin li paroi. So these are all proof positive to Shmuel's view that a shtar hakno is always returned to the creditor because of the strength of the document. Okay, very good. So now we have this method of proof, and we're fine. Not so fast, says the Gemara. Amalei Rab Zera, Kol Ma'aseh Bezdin Rashi. What's a Ma'aseh Bezdin? Kasol kadat of shtar shekasav bo handpick. All right, sheniskayim bebezdin. So remember, we discussed a handpick. A handpick is when you come to court and the creditor and the lov and the malva, the creditor and the debtor are both there, and you sign with Eidim in front of the court certifies the Eidim, and therefore the document is solid. Now, why do you do that? So you do that so that later, in other words, it's the malva, the creditor, the malva, who is the one who wants absolute certainty. So he wants to make sure that his money is protected, because at some point later, maybe the lover will say, I paid this. I actually paid it. So then you're going to say, wait a minute, if he denies that if he says it's okay, that he didn't pay it, fine. But if he denies it, maybe we're going to have to fight it out in court. So what the Malva does, in advance, he goes to the Bezdin, and he does the whole thing in front of Bezdin. The witnesses sign, and the Bezdin puts a certification on the witness's signature saying that it's 100% valid. So there's never a challenge to the actual document. That's called a handpick. A handpick where they put kind of a notary. A notary is what we described it when we talked about it. It's a notary saying that this is a valid document. So you can never challenge it later. So as Rashi says, "Kasol kadat ashtar shekosabo handpick sheniskayim bebezdin alma kiven deleka lemechesh." You don't doubt l'shema lo love that he didn't borrow. Shahare ein b'kaimin es ashtar alam b'fnei bal din, because this document with a handpick is only done in front of the debtor. So the debtor can never deny, oh, I never borrowed the money. Of course you borrowed the money. You were there. There were witnesses who signed, and we certified. The paroi lo chashinan. So we're not afraid to say that maybe it was paid, or that the lover will deny having made the loan. Okay, so this was a very solid support for Shmuel. Everything fine, says the Gemara, not so fast.
Hey, Rabbi,
Yeah.
when it comes to a get, they do it differently. Like Moshe would sign everything in front of Adam. He takes the get and rips it up and writes a letter so it can never be challenged. And he writes a letter given to both parties that this this divorce took place under his authority. So why is that so different? I mean, he could have done what this Gemara says, just write over the thing, and that this is certified or valid or something like that, with a marking pen right over the whole.
I think the system of Maimonides of dealing with commerce was different than what we do on the other side, meaning Gittin, Kedushin, Ksubis. That has a whole different set of halachas because of a different perspective. So, in other words, we don't do the same thing for commercial documents that we do for non-commercial documents. I mean, clearly there must have been something behind that, because you're right, they could have easily have just followed the same pattern and said, here we have ironclad witnesses, so there shouldn't be an issue. But the whole system of giving documents related to commerce were different than documents related to things like Gittin, Kedushin, and
I think there was a specific thing, if I remember correct, I could be wrong, but I think I heard once that with Gittin specifically, unlike almost everything else, because of the ramifications, if it turns out there was a problem,
right,
that there would be idea of tearing it up, then having something else to certify it, but tearing it up, because otherwise, if somebody later on came back and said, oh my goodness, you spelled the name of the city wrong or something like that, and all of a sudden now you've made somebody you possibly get. In the meantime, they both remarried, and it's a derisa.
Right. So in other words, the ramifications are so much different and greater. So you don't want to necessarily do, even though this system is a very strong system that we're now talking about, where you have a handpick and where you have in front of Bezdin, but nevertheless, you're right. So in other words,
not that there would be any concern that the get hadn't been given. This would certify that, but rather that it might have been invalid.
It might have been invalid, right? Good. All right, good point. So therefore we go into a whole different thing. Okay. So anyway, so here we have the question. Omalei Rav Zera. Rav Zera says, wait a minute. Omalei Rav Zera masnissen b'shtare chaltosa v'adrachta v'la b'nei peroinin. In other words, so comes Rav Zera, and Rav Zera says that from our Mishnah, you can't bring a raya, because our Mishnah is not talking about payback. It's not talking about where you have to pay someone back. It's talking about different kinds of documents. What kind of documents? So let's take a look at Rashi. B'shtar chaltosa. So chaltosa and adrachta are the following. A chaltosa is shtar shekosu bezdin. It's not for payback. It's a shtar that Bezdin writes, lemotzi shtar al chavero v'chayve l'shalem. It's a document written so that you can serve it on someone and say that you're chayav to pay me, v'lo shilem, v'yordu l'chosov, v'samul l'bal chov echad mehem, v'nos lo shtar shall be Bezdin ba'olam. So he's going to someone who has property belonging to the debtor, and he's serving him with that property, with that shtar. So the shtar itself isn't to collect. The shtar is to serve on someone else, to say to that someone else, you have to pay me this, you have to give me this property, or you have to pay me on behalf of the Baal Chov. So he's saying it's not a Baal Peron. It's not a document for recovery of money. So it's no proof to Shmuel's view. Because a proof to Shmuel's view means that here we have a document. With this document, you can collect, right? But you can't collect. This isn't a collection document. It's a document for service, for notice. And the same with Adrachta. Shalom motzalo achshav nechosim. He can't find any nechosim of the debtor. Because and he writes, Shiur dof laksa al nechosim. Ve'im yimtza yigbe. So basically, he puts this in his back pocket, And then he can go searching. He can hire a private investigator to search around the world and find out, does this guy have any property stuck somewhere that we don't know of? And if he does, he whips out the star and says, this is mine. Because I draft the lotion rodef umasi. It comes from the rodef, you chase and you reach. Como parsa bachala v'lo drachta. The lotion hamikra kisra es binyamin herdifu menucha edrichu. I didn't look up the pasuk and shoftim, but basically, what we're talking about is it's a security document to allow you to collect when and if you find property anywhere from him. So I don't know what the term would be that we would use in our system, but if a court issues whatever that document is, allowing someone to attach someone else's property. I forget, Jael, do you remember what is there a term for that? I forget, but basically that's, so he's saying it's not a raya from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah isn't talking about shtar peroin where you're actually collecting. So it's no raya to Shmuel that in such a document you collect. This is only a document that allows you to go somewhere else and potentially collect. But it's not a collection document per se. You don't get paid from it. So that's Rav Zera's point. So Rav Zera says, so, okay, so in other words, he's not arguing on Shmuel. He's just saying you can't bring a raya from that Mishnah, because that Mishnah isn't talking about documents from which you can collect. Okay, Omar Rava. So Rava says, "V'hana lav b'nei peroninu," and you're going to tell me that chaltasa and adrachta are not collection documents. Wait a minute. For Omar Nahardoi, in Nahardoi they said, "Shuma hoda atresa yachi shata." So what we have here is something called a tax lien. All right, a tax lien is where if you don't pay your taxes, then they can lien your property. Now, what does that mean? That means you have a certain amount of time to pay off the tax. Otherwise, that property goes to auction. In other words, people bid on that property and someone else can buy that property and the proceeds will go to pay the tax lien. That's what we have. That's our system. It's called tax lien. Now, this is kind of a tax lien, because what happens here, he says in Nerdoi, they said that if a property was confiscated for its value, then Atresa Yacheshata, he has 12 months to redeem. Now, we have the same system here, that in a tax lien, you can actually come back and redeem it, and you have to pay fairly onerous interest. In other words, maybe it's, I don't know, 12%, 15%, whatever it happens to be. So you can redeem it up to a certain point later, but you have to pay. So the person who is buying the property on tax lien is buying the property, but he also knows that he can't lose, because if for some reason he has to give up the property, he's going to make a substantial amount on it, because the interest rate to reclaim the property is very high. So people go around looking for tax liens or buying properties on tax liens, and either they keep the property, which is fine with them, or it gets redeemed for a very high amount of money. So Zok the Gemara there, what do you mean? You mean to tell me that a shtal chaltasa or drachta is not a Puron document? Of course it's a Puron document. Why? Because if you can attach with let's say a shtar drachta, and you go searching, when you find this piece of property and you attach it, that means it's now yours. But in their doi, they said you have 12 months to redeem it. So in that 12 months, it can be redeemed and it becomes a shtar piroin. It becomes a something you can pay with. And yet you see that you give it to the creditor, so it's a raya to Shmuel. You're telling me, Reb Zera, that it's not a raya to Shmuel because it's not a collection document, but it can turn into a collection document. Because in their doi, they used to use that very document to claim property. And then, so in other words, if that document would get lost, who would it go to? It would go to the creditor. It would go to the guy who just seized the property on tax lien, so to speak. So you see that it is a raya. And even further, says the Gemara, for Amar Ameimar, and Ameimar says, Ano min Nardor, I'm from Nardor, Ano, v'sfir le deshuma hoda la'olam. not just 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years later, the fella can come and redeem the property, which means it's never really yours. It's yours, but it's not yours because any fine morning he can come over and say, oh, by the way, I want to redeem my property and I'm allowed to redeem it. So, okay, that's a different discussion in a minute. But what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that you can collect from that document. So you're telling me, Reb Zera, you can't collect. Of course you can collect. You can collect either 12 months or 24 months or forever, and you're allowed to do it. So it should be a raya to Shmuel that a collection document that you could return it to the creditor, even if it's a collection document and you get money. That would be a proof to Shmuel's view. Okay, let's look at Rashi. Shuma, Sheshomu Bezdin Lebalchov Karka Halove. It comes from the word that they give. The Bezdin gives to the creditor the property of the love. Hoda Emir Falo Mos Atshana, according to the first view of a year, that he can pay off up to a year, and according to our Maimer, he can pay him off much longer. So, in other words, this is a good proof. This is a good proof to Shmuel. Ella Omar Rava. So now comes Rava and says, no, it's not a good proof to Shmuel. Why? We're going to make a chilik, and we're going to make a distinction. The reason why we say in the case where someone loses the shtar, in the regular case where someone loses the shtar, that it goes to the creditor is because he is his own fault. The fault is his. It's his fault. In other words, it's kind of like a penalty. It's a penalty because at the time that it was repaid, if in fact it was repaid, he should have torn up the shtar. In other words, the onus is on him for not doing what he should do. Therefore, we're saying that in a neutral situation where the shtar was lost and now it's found, your problem, because you could have solved it. If it was really your issue and you got paid, you should have torn it up. Inami, and if you're going to argue, but wait a minute, the creditor came to me and he said, I lost the shtar, but you have to repay me, and I repaid him, but I didn't get the shtar. In other words, you're saying I was duped because I really did pay, but he didn't give me the shtar. Then we say to him, wait a minute. If he didn't have the shtar, he should have given you a receipt. He should have given you another shtar. He should have given you something in hand. You don't go around saying, okay, sure, here it is, and give me the receipt tomorrow. I mean, I know I always ask for a receipt. Like today we have checks, so the check is a thing. But if I would pay somebody cash, wouldn't you ask him immediately for a receipt? Of course you would. So what you're doing is not the norm. You're telling me, oh, of course I paid him. So where's the receipt? What do you mean receipt? He told me he'll give it to me tomorrow. I believed him. Okay, so in other words, that's too superficial. Of course you should have gotten the receipt. So that's when the Gemara said he is the cause of his own problem, because he either should have torn it up or he should have asked for a receipt. So therefore, in that particular case, we give it to who? To the creditor, because it's not likely that he got paid and didn't get something for it.
Excuse me,
Now,
Rabbi.
yeah.
The notion that you have to get a receipt and you can't trust the other person. We have commerce today, like the Diamond District. Everything is done with a handshake. They don't write receipts.
They don't write receipts, and that's one of the. You're right, and
we trust people to a certain extent today.
Right. So that's a very interesting question because look, in modern times, if someone says to me, "Trust me," then you should immediately, just as a matter of course, and Chazal tell us this, that a person shouldn't necessarily put another person in a difficult position by saying, trust me. In other words, Yes, okay. Once upon a time, that was maybe the way of Mekach and Memcher. Today, by the way, my understanding is that in the diamond industry, people know each other. You wouldn't do it with someone off the street, but they know each other well enough, and they know their word is their bond because if the word gets out, even for a moment, and we're going to see this in the Gemara, we're going to talk about this, that a person was cheated or lied or did something, he loses all his business. In other words, it is such a trust-based business that the slightest hurrah, the slightest doubt, shadow cast on someone kills his business. So people are scrupulously honest because they know their entire business. But you're right, that's a remnant of the past, Jay. I mean, once upon a time, maybe that was the way everybody did business. And again, my understanding from the people that I know in the business is that you don't do it for everybody. I mean, clearly, if you're doing business with someone and that's their livelihood, but if someone came and said, "Trust me," and you don't know, you clearly wouldn't do that. But so the point being, of course, that maybe that's the equivalent of a star in that particular business because of the nature of the business, right? But standard? No, of course not. You have to have receipts. You have to have things, and let's say it's not because a person's a cheater. A person may forget. I mean, how many times have you done something and you really genuinely you don't have a senior moment. You're a young guy and you don't remember. Did I do this? Did I not do this? I mean, memories are fallible. So in order to create something that gives you clarity, it's always best to, like President Reagan used to say, trust but verify. Always have verification, a document, something. So today with checks and the things like that, we have a paper trail. I always say, you pay by check, by credit card, by something that you could later refer back and say, okay, yeah, I don't remember, but here it is. I got it. Happened to me just a couple of days ago in a business matter when something from 8 years ago, I clearly, there was some doubt in my mind about something, and I went back and checked and realized, yes, there was verification to that particular thing. But that's normal. I mean, we all have that. In order for us to keep a memory bank in our minds, it's pretty hard. So, so what he's saying here is, so he calls the problem on himself. What about Shuma? What about the case of where, like the tax lien situation? What about that? So he's saying in the Medina are loy boy l'mahader. So he's saying the Gemara telling us something very interesting. Rashi will expound. In the case of what I call the tax sale, where someone lost the property because he owed it, so he's saying really that property should never come back to him. Why did they have this principle of allowing the property to come back? Interesting, because of Mishum v'asisa hayosher v'hatov be'enei Hashem hu de'amar rabbanon to Hader. This is really something that is, I mean, it's something that has to do with us as Jews as a religion. Because in principle, in a tax lien, if I buy that piece of property, why should I return it to you? I bought it, okay, I paid for it, it's mine. The Torah tells us, and especially we just went through the Aseret HaDibros, the Torah gives us the 10 Commandments, and then next week in Mishpatim we're going to learn the rest of Taryag. But in that Taryag, and this is a pasuk from Devarim, by the way, V'asisa v'yoshev v'hatov is a net that is thrown over many other mitzvahs, and intentionally, this pasuk does not spell out which mitzvahs they are. This is intentional. Why? Because we as Jews live by a mantra of we follow the Taryag mitzvahs, but we do what's right and just. In other words, there's a sense of justice, a sense of righteousness, which hopefully all of us, but certainly we in our mind, there's a balance. And we say, what's the right thing to do? I know this is maybe what I should do, but what's the right thing to do? And the right thing to do is really what the Rabbanan. This is when we say it's midrabanan. What does midrabanan mean? It means that the rabbis imposed the asisa hayoshev v'atov. Sometimes it's more voluntary, and there are times when the Chachamim said, you know what, to fulfill this mitzvah, the Sisa v'Yosher Tov, this is how we have to conduct ourselves. So in this particular case, we say that, you know what, the right thing to do is to allow him to redeem. Why? Okay, so think about it. When you in commerce, when you go to a bank and a bank lends you money, is the bank interested in your property? No, they have no interest in your property whatsoever. They have an interest rate, they have this, they have fees and costs, all these wonderful things, and now you have your money. All of a sudden, you lost your fortune. I can't repay the debt. The bank has to repossess your property. You think they want to take that property? They don't want your property, but they have no choice but to take it, foreclose, and then try to sell it and get what? Get their money back. So the bank has no interest. You have an interest. Says the Gemara, when the guy who buys the tax lien, in our example, does he really want the property? No, he wants to make a buck. He's gonna make some money on this. So when the guy comes back a year later, or even 2-3 years later, and says, here's your money, you're gonna charge me 10%, 15, 18% interest, here it is. Then the right thing to do is to let him redeem it, because he wants that property. It's his property. It means something to him. It means nothing to you but a vehicle to make money. So a vehicle to make money, you'll make your money. Here it is, you're making your money. So the pshat is, in this particular case, we impose that on this situation, and that's why in the Hedor, they allowed redemptions a year, 2, 5 years later, to fulfill the mitzvah v'asisa v'yosher v'hatov. That's what the Gemara is telling us. It has nothing to do with the commerce part of it. In other words, there's no proof of paroin or not. It's about v'asisa v'yosher v'hatov. That's the pshat. So now let's
Rabbi,
yeah,
I have a question.
Yeah.
What you're saying, if the person is collecting an interest on the amount that's owed,
right,
and it goes on 5 years, let's say he's paying 10% on $100,000.
right.
In 10 years, he's going to be out double the amount of money. Not only is he going to lose the house, but the person who put up the money to pay the bank or whatever the note was, he's going to lose all that interest. He's not paying them any interest over that period of time.
No, no. Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about
But here somebody loses his property.
right.
Okay, I go back. I want to claim my property.
And in the meantime, there is an interest rate that has accrued on that property
Correct.
over the years. Okay.
Correct. So I go back and I say, well, it's 10% interest. You've got to pay me that. If I want it, I pay the 10% plus whatever the note was that he paid for.
Correct.
Now, let's say I don't. And assuming we have this unlimited amount of time, at one point that property is worth $100,000. Now it's worth $112,000 or $110,000 at 10%. In 2 more years, it's going to be $130,000.
Right.
But the property is only worth $100,000. So why should anybody want to go back and pay that additional interest and then walk away with something that's worth less than it is?
Oh, see, that's exactly the point. So a person wouldn't do that unless he has a certain attachment to that property, where he wants that property because it was his father's and grandfather's property. He wants to redeem it at all costs. That's where the pasuk v'asisha v'yosher v'hatov comes in, is that you should do the right thing because he wants that property for sentimentality. He's willing to lose 20, 30, 40%, like you say, because it's worth less to him than it is to the guy who wants it. So the guy who wants it doesn't want it necessarily for monetary reasons. He may want it for other reasons. And the Torah says, honor that request because he wants that property. It means something to him. You're right. From a dollar and cents point of view, it has no value. Why should he do it? I mean, it's ridiculous. But he's doing it because he came back and says, it's an heirloom. It's an heirloom. It's a property that was in my parents' generations for generations. I really want to bequeath this to my children. I feel terrible if I don't have the property. So there's probably other than monetary reasons why he would do it. The Torah says honor it. Honor it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Hoda im Yifel, the Medina Ara Lo Boy Mahadir, says Rashi. Tam Nosel Dvorov, Sharoy Lichtov Star Mechira Alea, Shekanuya Lo, Lachalutin, Umedinian Lo Boy Mahadir Bepidgin, Imlo Medato. He doesn't have to return it to him. There's no reason for him to return it to him. Right? So says the Gemara, yes, that's why we have a Sisa Yashavato, and that is what allows you to do it. Now, here's the okay. So now let's look at this chiddush here. Who do we want? Hilka. So now Hilkach Mereshahu because Zovin. So now we have a different situation. Now the Gemara is telling us that when this person, the one who bought the tax lien, bought the property, he now owns the property, it's his. So when the previous owner comes back, says the Gemara, he's not redeeming his property, he's buying the property anew. It's now a new transaction. It's not redeeming an old transaction, says the Gemara. Let's look at it differently. He's now buying the property anew for the first time. He's going to this creditor who now owns the property because he bought it on tax lien, right? And he's going to this guy and he says, I want to buy this property. Therefore, says the Gemara, he should have asked for a document. He said he should get a document to show that he bought the property. So now the Gemara is saying if he doesn't do that, then he's the loser. So in other words, it's not a standard case where he's coming to redeem something, says the Gemara. Don't look at it that way. Okay, look at it that it's a brand new transaction, that he is coming and buying a piece of property anew from somebody. And what do you do when you buy a piece of property? You paper it properly and you show that you bought the piece of property and you're the owner. So now, if this piece of paper is missing or if this piece of paper is lost, then we have a problem, right? Because then it's like any other transaction where you have a proof of ownership and you lose the proof of ownership, and now you want to make good on it. So that's how the Gemara wants to interpret that particular situation. So now the Gemara comes and says, so now we're going to see it's not a raya to Shmuel. You can't bring a raya to Shmuel that you give it to the creditor. Why? So the Gemara says, what are you going to say? You would normally say that if he before we said that the reason why he loses it because it's the obligations on him to rip up the star. Says the Gemara, wait a minute. Why do you say that that's what he would do? Maybe the Malva didn't have the star with him. And he said, you know what, do me a favor. The Amalei Lamacha Yahavnalach. The Hashta Lesa Gabe. How do you know that you want to make an assumption that the Balchov himself, the borrower in this case, is the one who should take the onus because he didn't rip up the star? What happens if he knew this? If he knew the creditor, and the creditor said, "You know what? Do me a favor. I left it in the house. I'm going to go back to the house and get it for you." And he says, "Sure." In other words, in the normal course, he doesn't suspect that the creditor is going to do him in. So he says, "Of course, I'll wait till tomorrow." Inami afshete de safra zayerle. There was a condition where everything was done with scribes, or basically, like we say, it was done with legal documents. Who pays the legal documents? The borrower. The borrower is always the one who pays all the costs and fees. So the borrower is the one who had to pay the sofer, and he didn't have the money. So he said to the creditor, do me a favor, lay out the money for me for the, whatever, 10 shekel, whatever it is for the sulfur, and I'll repay you. And the creditor says, sure. But in the meantime, I'm going to hold on to the shtar. I'm going to hold on to the document until you repay me the money for the sulfur. He said, fine, I'll do it that way. And then what happens? It gets lost. So the Gemara says with these doubts, you can't be certain that it belongs to the creditor, even if the debtor didn't do the right thing. Okay, so but he did it because he was relying on the creditor. So the Gemara says in that case we cannot return it to the creditor. So this is going to be, you can't bring a raya from this Mishnah to Shmuel. Shmuel's position is you always give it to the creditor, and you can't bring a raya here because the Gemara is showing you there could be a circumstance where innocently between the two they held off transferring the document, and then the document was lost. So in other words, you don't necessarily have to have a situation where it's the borrower's fault. It might not be the borrower's fault. It might be that he was a good guy and he said to the creditor, sure, I'll wait a day for you to give me back the document, or help me out here and pay the cipher and I'll give it back to you. So he said, sure, I'll pay it and when you give it back to me, I'll give you the shtar, and then it gets lost. So there could have been a very innocent reason for why the Baal Chov didn't rip it up, right? Because we're saying that he should be the one to rip it up, and here he couldn't rip it up because he didn't have it. He didn't have it yet. So therefore, we're saying it's not 100% certain that it should go to the creditor. Therefore, this is not a raya to Shmuel. So Shmuel himself holds that the creditor, if it's lost, it goes to the creditor. But for this Mishnah, you can't bring that raya. Says Rashi. Meresha de Kozovin, Kloma Ainze Pigeon, Elatchilis Kinyan, Kilu Shalo Hoysel, Kilu Shalo Hoysel, Lefika Hakozov, Star Mechira Lea, Ainator, Vahoyalo, Lazel, Litvoa, Star Mechira, he should have asked for it, Hol Vidachu, Malahaxelo, Star Shalbezin. Inami, if shit suffer Zirele, Al Halova Litin Schar Hasofer, like we said, it's on the Lova to pay the scribe, Upavamim She'ain Lo Mos, the Lova Bishas Halvo. There are times that he doesn't have the money to pay. And the malva pays the money for the writing, which is not his obligation. And when he pays it, and then when he gets repaid, he gives them the schar. So in other words, so what we see from here is that there are circumstances in a very simple way where he doesn't return it. Zayar loshen oitzer kamo mazracha zaira b'loshen amikra v'yazer sagaza. So anyway, so what we see from this Gemara is that there are circumstances where it does not go back to the borrower's hands for a legitimate reason, and therefore the Gemara says from this we don't have a raya that you can automatically give it back. Okay, now this sugya, we end the sugya on hamotzi shtar hakno. So Shmuel is for his reasons, and there are other circumstances where Shmuel doesn't, where Shmuel's ruling does not apply. Okay, by shtar hakno. Now, we'll just start this next piece, because now we go back to our situation. What is our situation? A regular chov, a regular shtar chov. Omar Rabbavu, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, says Rabbavu in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, ha-motzi shtar chov b'shuk, not shtar hakno. If someone finds a shtar chov in the shuk, which is a regular document, afal pi shekosav bo henpik, even though there was a henpik, which we said before, was this ironclad certification of witnesses, lo yachzeru lebalim. He should not return it to the creditor. So now, right away, we see that this Gemara doesn't conform with Shmuel's Gemara. Shmuel's Gemara by Shtar Kno says everything goes back to the creditor. Here we see a situation where in a regular Shtar Chov, even with a handpick, you don't return it. Says the Gemara, Lo Maboy Hecha Velo Kosabo handpick. For sure, where there is no handpick, the Ikalamema Kosa Vlolova Vlolova. In the case where there's no handpick, then you can clearly say there might never have been a loan in the first place. In other words, it was written, but it never happened. And that was our Gemara in the past. We gave all kinds of circumstance where they wrote the shtar, but the halva never took place. Okay, so we have to be worried. But says the Gemara, afilu kosovo handpick, even though there was a certification of witnesses, where you would think that automatically it happened, and therefore he should be able to collect. We say lo yachzor, ma'inyo de mikuyim lo yachzor the chashinin lipiroin. So in this particular case, we're concerned for piroin, that it was paid, and that it was not torn up. So you see a totally different perspective in the case of a regular balchov, where there was a regular document, not a shtar hakno. The Gemara says that you don't return it to the balam, regardless of whether there was a handpick or not. If there was no handpick, then we worry whether the shtar chov is even actual. Was there a loan? Because we know that was many circumstances where they wrote documents and the loan was never made. And if there is a handpick, and remember, a handpick is written in front of the borrower. So the borrower can no longer deny that there was a loan. Of course there was a loan. You were there when we certified the witnesses. But there, we're afraid that maybe it was paid and he didn't get the document back. So in other words, both sides of the coin, whether with a handpick, without a handpick, the Gemara is saying that you can't return it to the creditor. It has to go to Beis Din, and they have to fight it out or somehow figure out to whom it belongs. Different circumstance. Frek the Gemara, Eisve Rabbi Yirmiyah Ravo. So now Rabbi Yirmiyah asks on Rabbi Vo, who said the name of Rabbi Yochanan. You just got through saying, and we saw this in the Mishnah later. Kol Masa Beis Din Harazeh Yachzir. Any Masa Beis Din, any certification that goes through a court, you return to the balim, to the creditor. How can you tell me that you don't return it because maybe it belongs to the balchov, it belongs to the debtor? We just got through saying in this Mishnah said kol masa beis din, any act of court where the court gets involved and puts its imprimatur on a document, that shows that it should go back to the creditor. So what are you telling me? You're worried about all these things. That's not what the Mishnah says. We have a Farish Mishnah that says it should belong to the creditor. How can you say that in a regular balchov, in a regular case, it doesn't go back to the creditor? Al Malay. So Rabbi Vo, or Yirmiyah B'ni. So Rabbi Vo said, Yirmiyah, my son, lo kol masa beis din shavin. Not every masa beis din. When it says kol masa beis din, not every masa beis din is alike. You can't paint it with one stroke and one brush and say, whenever there's a masa beis din, you have to return it. There are differences. How? El kagon shehuchsa kafran, where a person was determined to be a kafran, like a liar or a cheater, he has a negative chazaka, so therefore we don't believe him. So he says our situation is speaking about a case where a person is huchsa kafran. He became a kafran. He had this moniker of a kafran, and therefore you can't believe him. So Rashi says, "Kol masa beis din, v'hainami masa beis din hu." In this case, Yirmiyah B'ni shehuchzik love zeh kafran, pam acheres. In other words, in another case, he earned the reputation of a kafran, which, by the way, answers the question, Jay, about the diamond industry, because this is the point. When a person has this moniker of a kafran, he is forever excluded. His business falls apart. So he can't afford to be a cheater, unless, of course, he cheats on such a large scale that he can retire and never have to go back to the diamond business. But if he wants to conduct business, he has to have a stellar reputation. Therefore, they rely on the handshake, because the handshake is their star. Okay, I mean, I'm still a little worried, but yes, that's the answer. So in other words, the answer is that not every Masa Bezin is the same. And here he was considered a kafran, and therefore, because he's a kafran, therefore we don't return it to him. Frek the Gemara Amar Rava Mishum Dehuchse Kafran Choda Zimna Sulo Para Klau, because one time he was a kafran, he can't do tshuva, he can't become a good guy again. One time he did something wrong. Okay, fine. So he got his punishment. Does that mean that forever he's going to have this moniker of kafran, and you won't allow him to conduct business? Ela Omar Rava Misnisen Bishtal Chalto V'Adrachta Uked Rab Zera. So in other words, so the Gemara says that it's a different circumstance. That we're not talking about kafran, we're talking about shtar chalto v'adrachta, the same answer we gave before according to Rab Zera, and therefore this is a different circumstance. In other words, he wants to take this case out of the realm of the norm. He says normally, yes, okay, yes, we can forgive. But we're talking about a document that isn't a document of Peron. Remember, according to Rab Zera, a Chaltoa V'Adrachta are different documents. It's only Rava who asks the question. But according to Rab Zera, these are different. These are not collection documents. Therefore, we're not worried about collection. So in other words, so that's how he gives his teretz. Okay? So he says they are Adrachta Uked Rab Zera. So what have we learned here? So what we've learned is that the Gemara wants to make some kind of a parallel between shtar hakno and a shtar chov. So Shmuel says by shtar hakno that you always give it back to the creditor because it's iron tight. We have other circumstances which we gave different terutzim. All right, so there is a machlekes. That Mishnah that we thought was supporting Shmuel is not supporting Shmuel. Okay, now what about shtar chov? Shtar chov is a different circumstance entirely. So one teretz is that we're talking about a kafran, that really you're right, you return it, that really you don't return it. But the reason why you return it here is because we can't return it to the debtor because he's a liar. So we no longer believe him. Therefore, we have to return it to the creditor, not because the creditor is automatically the owner, but because in this particular case, he's the owner because we can't trust the kafran, the liar, the cheater, the lovet. We can't trust it. That's one teretz. The other teretz is that, no, wait a minute, like Rava said, it's no raya at all because these are not collection documents, and therefore it's a different parsha entirely, and we're not worried about it. So that's a different teretz, and we answered that way. Now, very interestingly, take a look at the bottom tosfos, the last tosfos on the daf. The Gemara asks the kasha, and because he once said he was found to be a cheater or a liar, he no longer has nemanis. Shani the mucha milza the mishum hachi loy hoya nizel l'shamul if yishapara halove. Tosfos is making a very interesting point. If you have a document that says that you are owed $1,000, that's a valuable document, right? Okay, today we have safe deposit boxes, but what would you do with the document? What would you do with the document? You put it for safekeeping. You put it under a lockbox. You put it under the mattress. I mean, you would guard it with your eye teeth, right? Because that's a valuable document. This document was found lying in the street. Says Tosfos, the fact that it was lying in the street should already give you an indication that it was paid, because otherwise the creditor would never have lost it. So Tosfos is saying that the fact that it was not in his possession is a raya that it's not his. In other words, the Gemara is asking a question, is asking a question. You mean to tell me that because a guy cheated once in his life, he's forever condemned to be called a kafran? That's not right. And therefore the Gemara gives a different teretz. Tosfos is asking, wait a minute. Okay, he was a cheater one time, but look at the other side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that this piece of paper was treated like tissue paper. It was found in the street. That can't belong to a creditor if it was found on the street. So Tosfos is saying that the mere fact that the document wasn't in the creditor's possession is a raya that it's not his, and therefore should belong to the debtor. That's what Tosfos is saying. The nafal shani, the mucher chamilsa, it's obvious. The mishum hachi lo haya nizer l'shomro, he didn't guard it. Lefi shapara halove, because the lover paid. So he basically gave it to him. And the lover was the one who was slipshod. But the creditor, the guy who's owed the money, in other words, the lover kind of figures, I paid him, I got the document back, okay, no, I'm not worrying about it. He stuck it in his papers and it got lost. But the creditor who's owed the money, he would never do that because he's owed this money. So, but the nature of where it was found, it's a raya that it doesn't belong to the creditor. That's how the Gemara wants to answer that. So it's a very interesting. So the bottom line is that Shmuel is lishitaso. Shmuel says that it always goes to the creditor, but we see from the machlokes there and from this Gemara that it doesn't necessarily follow that we follow Shmuel, because we see that in other circumstances we don't give it to the creditor, either because you say it's a shtar chalta, it's a different kind of document, so it's no raya to Shmuel, or because in fact we don't give it to the guy because it shows that he's not really the creditor, meaning that he really got paid because he's not careful with the document.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Would that be the practice today? Just because something's found in the street, you automatically say that it was paid?
No. So la halacha.
Justice's answer seems to say, raise a lot of questions.
Right. So again, the Gemara, you have to understand that in the Gemara's thinking, there are normal courses of action. Remember, we have developed a whole system of Mekach and Memker, which is far more, I'll call it sophisticated, but sometimes simpler is better. But it's a much more complicated system today where I grant you that if a document is found, now, let me just say something, just to show you the difference. If you find a document, a note of a loan, that's one thing. If you find a bond in the street, a bond has finders keepers. A bond has no connection to it, even though a lender and a buyer or a buyer and a seller transacted, that bond is money. It's like finding money in the street. But to your point, no. If a document, a loan document, which is a perfectly fine document, is found, then that's it doesn't automatically go to one or the other. You're right. That becomes a point of dispute, and there has to be because today we have mechanisms to see if it was paid. I mean, today you could do forensic, right? You can see if it's a big sum of money. Did the borrower? Did the creditor make a big deposit? In other words, there's somehow ways of tracing to see if post that transaction something happened, right? There's a possibility, but you're right. La halacha, this becomes a much more complicated situation than what the Gemara is posing, because it's not clear one way or the other. We don't go by the theory.
Joe is muted here. He's trying to say something. Joe,
Jay, what you're referring to and what the Tosfos was saying and all, I think I take a slightly different perspective on this, and I think it has to do with modern versus ancient times, because what was the cost and of value of a sofer and writing documents? Because if you look at how the Gemara is put together, saving paper or saving writing was how things, why do we have this issue where things are incomplete and not understood, is because you're trying to save the ability to write. So therefore, if a sofer is going to actually write something and you want to document the cost and the value of that document is so high and so expensive, because if you saw, as I mentioned in the Gemara, the cost of it was on the debtor to pay, not on the creditor. Therefore, when you think about those things, you think about the cost, you think about how everything had to be handwritten at that time, as it's not now. Therefore, there was a substantial desire, interest, cost to creating such a document, and keeping such a document was of high value to everyone. So therefore, if you lose a document like this, you need to think about in those terms. And then this last part that we're talking about, that the debtor gets it back and therefore it's of no value, or it is of lesser value at that point, I think drives that point home.
That's an excellent point, is that the value of the document was such that it was valued. In other words, it's not just a piece of scrap of paper. It was a document that was carefully done, paid for, etc. So that's the Gemara's point. The fact that it was found in the street is proof positive, according to Tyson's view, that it doesn't belong to the creditor, because if it had such value to him, he never would have lost it. It wouldn't have gone lost. Whereas for the lover, I paid it, it's off my chest. Okay, in other words, the lover will not be as meticulous in keeping the document because he paid it than the creditor would if he hadn't been paid. So that's a very good point. So in other words, whereas today it's a whole different thing. Documents, we print paper by the tens of thousands when we transact. We don't worry about who's writing the paper. I mean, they get shot out as if there was unlimited number of trees, and you kill a tree every time you do a deal because it's so heavily papered. So that's a very good point. So that's the chilek. So in the time of the Gemara, there was a different perspective on the shtar and the value of the shtar and what the shtar means than today. But so clearly today, the paper is only sort of the front to the deal. I guess if you lose the paper, you lose the document, you don't lose the deal because there's so much behind it. At the time of the Gemara, the paper was the deal. That was the deal. And therefore, there was a much bigger emphasis on the paper. Very interesting point. Very good point there. Yeah.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so we come to this point, in which next week actually the Gemara is going to pick up and talk a little bit about this issue of Kafran. But so here we've kind of ended the discussion on Shmuel as to whether or not who you return it to. Shmuel is Lishitaso, but you see, not everybody holds like him that you automatically return it to the creditor. The bottom line is when you do a deal, paper it correctly, be careful, don't lose the paper that it's written on, because it does have value, and then everybody will be happy. But unfortunately, life is, and documents get lost and things happen. So we have to, but it's an interesting thing, Jay, to your point, that the Gemara did answer that the term kafran had such an impact that if a person was called a kafran, he could lose the ability to do business. Hence, since I guess the diamond industry, maybe more than any other, is a throwback to the old way, because you're talking about the Jews of the old school. So to them, it was like the Gemara. Yeah, we have an agreement. Okay, yes, put in the paper, not in the paper. But unfortunately, today in modern times, that's not so easily transacted.
Most of the diamond dealers have learned this Gemara.
In the diamond business, they finish every transaction with mazel and bracha, because you got to have at least one or the other.
But one of the traditions that I came to find out in the diamond industry very often is when they turn back to business, they drink a l'chaim. They actually drink a l'chaim, to a successful deal. That really shows you, what kind of throwback we have. Anyway, all right, everybody have a good week. Stay safe. Bye gesund.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.